when God draws the line. There are moments in life when the soul breaks, not from the force of a single blow, but from the weight of invisible chains worn too long. You smile in public, you pray in private, and still something within you whispers, this is not peace, it's performance. You gave your heart to someone who promised protection, but delivered control. And every time you tried to speak your truth, they baptized your pain in silence. What you called love, God called captivity. What you tried to fix, He had already marked for removal. You see, God watches the soul more than the situation. He sees what no one else sees, the slow erosion of your identity beneath the mask of false intimacy. He hears the prayers you whispered when no one else was listening. And when your strength began to bend beneath the weight of manipulation dressed as care, He didn't send thunder, He sent separation. It didn't come with flashing signs or a loud voice from the sky. It came in the form of a door closed, a relationship unraveling, a chapter ending. But it wasn't chaos, it was choreography. It was the divine hand of a loving Father saying, enough. My child will not be consumed by this any longer. If you've ever wondered why the person who once held your heart began to feel like a storm you couldn't escape, this message is for you. If you've questioned why love started to feel like survival and why God would let it all fall apart, know this. He didn't let it fall. He pulled you out before it collapsed. This is not the story of abandonment. This is the story of divine interruption, where God Himself steps into the reign of narcissistic power and breaks the spell with one sacred act, separation. And when God separates, the narcissist's reign ends, not with noise, but with authority. Deliverance begins the moment you realize it was never love, it was spiritual captivity. There is a certain pain that doesn't scream. It doesn't bruise the skin or leave visible wounds. It grows in the silence between words that should have brought healing, but instead carried control. It festers in the space between I love you and why do I feel like I'm disappearing. And long before you ever walk away physically, you begin to drift internally, not out of bitterness, but out of awakening. This is where deliverance truly begins, not in the moment of escape, but in the revelation of truth. And that truth is this: what you thought was love was a cleverly disguised war against your soul. The narcissist didn't fall in love with your essence, they latched onto your light. They didn't cherish your presence, they consumed it, slowly, strategically, spiritually. It often begins in the most deceptive ways. Prayer circles that feel like confession traps, compliments that carry hidden criticisms, silence used not as space for peace, but as a weapon of punishment. You find yourself walking on eggshells in a house that claims to be built on grace. You cry, then apologize for crying. You speak, then retreat for speaking too much. You give, but the more you give, the more you vanish. And still you stay, because you were taught that love endures all things, that suffering proves sincerity, that loyalty means staying even when your soul begins to disintegrate. But the kind of love God calls holy does not erase you to make someone else feel whole. Somewhere along the way, your prayers shifted from God fix us to God help me survive this. You began to plead not for restoration, but for clarity, for air, for the return of your own voice. And you started to realize, quietly at first, that you weren't in a covenant. You were in captivity, not in a relationship, but in a rehearsed performance where your role was to absorb damage and still smile on cue. This is what makes narcissistic love so spiritually dangerous. It masquerades as intimacy, but functions as theft. It borrows language from the kingdom while building a kingdom of control. The narcissist may quote scripture, attend church, even lead prayer, but their fruit reveals their spirit. Their love doesn't free you, it traps you. It doesn't uplift, it conditions. Their forgiveness is a delay tactic, not a doorway to change. You're not cherished, you're managed. And in your spirit, something sacred begins to tremble. A holy discomfort rises. A voice long buried beneath years of accommodation begins to speak again. This is not who I am. This is not who God is. This is not what love is meant to feel like. That voice is not rebellion. It is the whisper of heaven. It is the Holy Spirit beginning to reclaim His territory, your heart. Because God does not allow His children to be devoured in the name of devotion. He does not celebrate blind loyalty that leads to spiritual decay. He is not glorified by your exhaustion. And so, when the cost of staying becomes the burial of your calling, He intervenes. And how does He do it? Not always with thunder, not always with fire. Sometimes God rescues with a slow unraveling, a disconnect, a distance that widens until you're no longer able to pretend. Until the mask they wore begins to slip, not because they changed, but because you finally stopped covering for them. Until the weight of your silence becomes heavier than the fear of their rage. Until the prayers you prayed begin to shift from Lord, help me love them, to Lord, remind me who I am. This is where the narcissist's reign begins to end, not when they collapse, but when you awaken. God begins to show you that what you called strength was actually survival, that what you called patience was spiritual suppression, that your peace had been bought at the price of self-erasure. He begins to untangle your worth from their approval. He peels back the layers of guilt and shame and false responsibility, and He reveals a hard, sacred truth. You were never responsible for their healing, but you are responsible for your own obedience to my voice. And that obedience will sometimes lead you away from the manipulation, away from the gaslighting, away from the script you've been reciting for years. He calls you into clarity. And with that clarity comes pain, but also permission. Permission to stop sacrificing your spirit for someone who never truly saw it. Permission to stop holding space for someone who used your grace as a throne. Permission to walk, not in bitterness, but in boldness. Therefore come out from among them and be separate, says the Lord. Touch no unclean thing, and I will receive you. Verse 2, Corinthians 6:17. This is the moment of severance. This is the sacred fracture where heaven does its most merciful work. And make no mistake, when God separates, He does so with finality, not out of cruelty, but out of fierce compassion. Because He knows what you still struggle to admit. If He doesn't separate you, you'll stay until you forget who you are. The narcissist's power was never in their strength, it was in your confusion. And the moment your mind begins to clear, the throne they sat on begins to crumble. Not because you fought harder, but because you stopped bowing, you stopped playing the part, you stopped offering your spirit as a sacrifice on the altar of their ego. And when that happens, God moves, not to patch things back together, but to pull you out before you lose yourself entirely. But once you begin to see that what you endured was never true love, the next unveiling begins. Understanding how false intimacy cloaked itself in spiritual language and held you hostage with charm instead of chains. False intimacy is not love, it's spiritual camouflage. The most dangerous prisons are not made of bars but of illusion. The narcissist's reign does not begin with fists or fury, it begins with fascination. With words so gentle they disarm you, with prayers so well rehearsed they almost sound holy, with gestures that imitate affection but are secretly designed to disarm your discernment. They do not charge in demanding control. No, they charm their way in, wearing the scent of empathy and the language of God, only to rewrite the definition of love in their own image. And slowly you begin to adjust. You adjust how much you speak. You adjust how much you shine. You adjust your dreams, your tone, your walk with God, until the version of you that remains is only the shadow of who God created you to be. This is not love. It is camouflage, a mirroring, a mimicry. It is false intimacy layered in spiritual vocabulary. They echo your prayers, quote your scripture, mimic your faith, yet they do not share your spirit. They study your soul not to cherish it, but to replicate and exploit it. They do not admire your peace, they envy it. And that envy leads them to do something far more devastating than destroy you. They impersonate you. You begin to feel it, but you can't explain it. You feel drained, even after small conversations. You feel anxious when you see their name on your phone. You pray harder, but feel emptier. You try to reason with them, but your words are twisted. You ask for truth, but receive performance. You reach for safety and are handed spiritual stagecraft. This is not affection, it is theft. And because it hides under the name of love, it is all the more deceptive. When you are in a spiritually abusive relationship, especially with a narcissist, the confusion becomes so dense you begin to second-guess your own discernment. You say things like, maybe I'm overthinking it, or maybe I'm just too sensitive. But what if your sensitivity is your discernment? What if your tears are not signs of weakness, but sacred signals that the spirit in you is grieved? This is the power of false intimacy. It doesn't break you with cruelty. It bends you slowly with charm. And by the time you realize what's happening, your confidence has been siphoned, your identity distorted, your boundaries dissolved. And still you stay, because you were taught to be patient, because you saw a glimpse of who they could be, because they apologized last time, because they cried, because they held your hand when they tore you down with their words. And so the cycle repeats. One moment of tenderness for 1,000 moments of tension. One kind act used to justify a pattern of emotional sabotage. This is not what God intended. Love is not supposed to feel like survival. By their fruit you will know them. Matthew 7:16. And if the fruit is confusion, exhaustion, and spiritual decline, then the tree is not of God, no matter how many prayers it imitates. Real love doesn't require you to disappear. It doesn't demand that you become less so someone else can feel more. Real love brings clarity, not chaos. It sets you free. It doesn't bind you with guilt. And it protects your spirit even when it corrects your behavior. But counterfeit love, it wants your silence. It wants your compliance. It wants your worship, without offering real covering in return. That's why the narcissist thrives in spiritual spaces, because where people seek healing, they see opportunity. Where people seek safety, they see advantage. They present themselves as saviors, as godly men or women, but what they actually do is feed off the light they no longer carry within themselves. And when they sense you waking up, when you start to question, set boundaries, or reclaim your time, they panic. Not because they love you, but because they are losing their grip. This is why God must intervene. You can't always see the depth of spiritual warfare when it wears a smile. But God does. He sees the predator cloaked in Christian phrases. He sees the spirit of control wrapped in charm. He sees the subtle erosion of your faith as you slowly trade communion with Him for emotional survival, with someone who uses God's name in vain, not in profanity, but in manipulation. And so He moves. He begins to loosen the attachment. He causes distance to grow where once there was codependency. He allows disappointment, not to punish you, but to wake you up. He lifts the veil, not to humiliate you, but to bring you home. And in the exposure of their false love, your true healing begins. Because real love never competes with your relationship with God, it strengthens it. It does not drain you, it draws you deeper into wholeness. So if you find yourself constantly pouring, constantly apologizing, constantly empty, step back, listen to the grief in your own spirit, hear what heaven has been whispering. This is not love. This is loss disguised as loyalty. And I did not create you to be consumed by someone else's brokenness. God is calling you into truth, into clarity, into alignment with the real definition of love, the kind that lays down control, not your identity. If you've ever been caught in a cycle of false intimacy, comment below with the words, "I see it now. I choose truth over illusion. I choose God's love over control." And once you see the truth of what it was, God does not leave you to battle it alone. He does what only heaven can do. He draws a line and speaks a word that undoes every spiritual entanglement. Enough. When God says enough, He does not whisper to evil. He commands it to let you go. There is a limit in heaven, a divine boundary written not in ink but in spirit. You may not see it, but God does. And while you are trying to save what is slowly killing you, while you are praying for patience as you sink deeper into spiritual erosion, while you are still calling it love, God is watching with holy grief. He is not distant. He is not idle. He is waiting, not for the narcissist to change, but for your permission to rescue. Because here is the unspoken truth. God will not force a door open unless you're ready to walk through it. But when your soul finally cries out, not for another apology, not for another second chance, but for freedom, God moves. And when He does not knock gently. He declares war on the structure built to contain you. That moment when heaven says enough is not symbolic, it is strategic. You may feel it as a breaking point, a collapse, a loss, but in reality it is a divine confrontation, a tearing away of everything God never planted. And what is removed in that moment is not just the person who hurt you, but the access they had to your soul. When God intervenes, He does not just pull you out of the relationship, He dismantles the spiritual stronghold that was feeding on your calling. Because a narcissist is not just emotionally destructive, they are spiritually parasitic. Their control wasn't just over your choices, it was over your perception of yourself, your understanding of God, your very discernment. And so the rescue must be surgical. God begins to cut ties you didn't even know existed, emotional bonds masked as loyalty, trauma bonds mistaken for endurance, manipulative cycles cloaked as forgiveness. He begins to reveal how you were taught to see yourself through their dysfunction, how you were conditioned to tolerate mistreatment in the name of humility, how your light was dimmed slowly, not by accident, but by design. The narcissist did not love you in the way love was created to function. They bonded to your strength while resenting your stability. They relied on your forgiveness but never honored your boundaries. They drank deeply from your well but mocked the source from which you drew, God Himself. And so, when the time comes, God removes you, not as an act of abandonment, but as an act of divine preservation. But here's what most people do not understand. When God removes you, He also removes Himself from the counterfeit structure. His presence withdraws. His covering lifts. His silence begins to echo around the one who once fed off your spirit. Because the narcissist wasn't just feeding on you. They were benefiting from the grace God placed on your life. You were the one praying. You are the one interceding, you are the one standing in spiritual authority, and when you are gone, the spiritual access closes. What remains is hollow performance, a structure without glory, a name without peace, a soul that is now alone with its reflection, and that reflection no longer flatters because the light that once concealed their darkness is now gone. This is the beginning of their collapse. Not all collapses come with noise. Some begin in silence. The kind of silence that creeps in when manipulation no longer works, when performance no longer earns sympathy, when they reach for control and find that the power they once wielded is no longer available. This is how God ends the reign of the narcissist, not by striking them down in front of you, but by removing their ability to rule over you, not with fire from heaven, but with an unshakable no in your spirit. And when you agree with heaven, when your yes to God becomes louder than your what if to them, everything shifts. They do not fall because you expose them. They fall because God has withdrawn His hand, because He will not bless what was built on manipulation. He will not protect a bond that demands your silence and calls it virtue. He will not abide in the presence of control and call it covenant. That's why the narcissist spirals when you leave, not because they lost your affection, but because they lost divine proximity. They can no longer access the peace they siphoned from your presence, and the unraveling begins, not in public, but in the shadows. Because the truth is this, what the narcissist feared most was not your absence, it was your awakening, your ability to see clearly, to say no and mean it, to walk away and not return. And when that moment comes, they do not simply lose you, they lose the spiritual scaffolding they stood on for years. And that scaffolding was never theirs. It was yours. It was borrowed favor. And heaven always demands it. When God says enough, He does not negotiate. He separates. And when He separates, He sanctifies. He doesn't just rescue you from the narcissist. He rescues you from the parts of yourself that were conditioned to accept their rule. He breaks the cycle, not by fixing the narcissist, but by healing your identity. And once that identity is restored, their reign can never resume, because the door they once entered is now sealed by God Himself. You no longer bow. You no longer break. You no longer beg for crumbs from a table God never asked you to sit at. You walk away, not just free in body, but free in spirit. And that is the moment their reign ends. Yet even after God removes you, the journey isn't over, because what comes next is often misunderstood, feared, even mistaken for failure. It is not. What follows divine separation is not absence. It is sacred silence. The silence after separation is not emptiness. It is the sanctuary where God rebuilds you. When the separation finally happens, whether through heartbreak, betrayal, or a quiet walking away, what follows is not always immediate relief. It is silence. A silence so wide and hollow it echoes through your entire being. You thought breaking free would feel like triumph, but instead you sit alone with memories, confusion, and the debris of what you once called love. And in that stillness, doubt creeps in. Was it really that bad? Did I overreact? Maybe I could have tried harder. This is the danger of soul ties forged through manipulation. Even after the chains fall off, your mind still remembers the rhythm of captivity. The narcissist didn't just occupy your time, they reshaped your internal world. They embedded themselves in your routines, your beliefs, your prayers. And now that they're gone, you feel the absence not just in your day, but in your identity. But what you're feeling is not emptiness, it is space. What you're hearing is not abandonment. It is the voice of God returning. Because once the noise of manipulation ceases, once the spiritual static clears, you begin to hear again, not their voice, but His. And what He speaks is not accusation, it is not blame, it is not, why didn't you leave sooner, or you should have known better, No, it is gentler than that, more sacred. He says, I never left. I was waiting for you here, in the silence. This is the beginning of holy reconstruction. This is where God does his most tender work. Because when he removes someone from your life, he is not simply subtracting. He is making room. Room for clarity, room for healing, room for the version of you that existed before trauma rewrote your value. And what he rebuilds in that silence is not simply your confidence. He rebuilds your discernment. He teaches you the difference between love and control, between empathy and performance, between peace and compliance. He redefines words the narcissist distorted, words like forgiveness, patience, and sacrifice. He shows you how those virtues were weaponized to keep you bound, and he redeems them, restoring their meaning as they were always intended to be, reflections of his character, not instruments of your suppression. You begin to see, with painful clarity, that much of what you endured was not spiritual testing, it was spiritual theft. Your devotion was used against you. Your compassion became currency in someone else's manipulation. And yet, God does not shame you for it, he honors it. He holds your innocence with reverence. He does not say you should have known, he says, even in that place, you were still mine. This is the nature of divine love. It does not meet you with judgment at the border of freedom. It meets you with restoration. And restoration is not a return to who you were before the relationship. It is the becoming of who you were always meant to be. In that silence, God reminds you of your original design. The you that existed before you were redefined by another's insecurity. The you who laughed freely. The you who prayed without fear. The you who didn't apologize for taking up space. That person isn't gone, they were buried, but not dead. And in the stillness of separation, God breathes on what was dormant and calls it back to life. What once felt like loneliness becomes solitude. What once felt like punishment becomes preparation. And what once felt like the end becomes the beginning of something untouchable by human hands. The narcissist may have known how to trigger your pain, but they never had access to your full purpose. They may have mimicked your light, but they could never produce it. And when God separates you, he does so to protect the promise he placed within you long before they arrived. You will begin to see the signs of this reconstruction not through grand achievements, but in small, sacred shifts. You wake up and no longer feel dread. You pray and no longer second-guess yourself. You look in the mirror and no longer see someone to fix, but someone to honor. These are not just signs of recovery. These are markers of resurrection. Because make no mistake, what God is building in this season is not a repair job. It is a complete recreation. He is not patching up your wounds. He is pouring new wine into new wineskins. And that takes time, that takes stillness, that takes silence, but it is sacred silence, the kind that births identity, not isolation. Do not despise this quiet season. Do not rush through it. For what you're standing in right now is not the absence of love, it is the incubation of truth. And that truth will become your anchor, not in who they were, but in who you've now become in Christ. The silence after separation is not empty. It is the sanctuary where God is reintroducing you to yourself. And from that place, the real rising begins. And while God is rebuilding you in the sanctuary of stillness, something else is happening in the unseen. The narcissist begins to feel the weight of a loss they can neither name nor reverse, the loss of spiritual access. When the narcissist loses access, their collapse begins, and your resurrection follows. There is something the narcissist never expected, that you would stop needing their approval, that you would see through the glitter of their charm and recognize it for what it was, a mask carved from your own empathy. They never believed you'd find your way out because they believed their control ran deeper than your calling. What they did not account for was God. You see, the collapse of the narcissist does not begin when you walk away. It begins the moment you are no longer spiritually available, the moment your soul steps out from under their influence. Their source of strength starts to fade, because their strength was never truly their own. It was a siphon, a counterfeit power drawn from your prayer life, your kindness, your spiritual anchoring. You carried the weight of the relationship. You absorbed the confusion, you covered them in intercession, and when that covering lifts, something invisible begins to shatter. From the outside, they may look unbothered, smiling, succeeding, even posturing as victims. But behind the performance, a famine has begun, a famine of presence, a famine of light, because God does not allow His glory to remain in a temple built on deception. And when He removes His light from what was false, even the most convincing facade begins to crack. This collapse is not always visible to the world, but it is deeply real in the spirit. The narcissist may not crumble in a day. There may be no loud confession, no dramatic downfall. But there is something worse. The withdrawal of divine access. The presence they never honored now eludes them. The favor they mock no longer covers them. And what they are left with is themselves, not the version they portrayed, but the one they hid from. The one that cannot create peace because it never knew peace. God's justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it arrives in reversal. The manipulator finds themselves confused. The abuser feels powerless. The one who once controlled every room now finds no one waiting to applaud. And in that unraveling, God is not cruel, He is righteous. Because you were not left behind, you were lifted out. And what He lifts out, He restores, not to who you were before, but to the one you were destined to become. Because while their collapse begins, your resurrection unfolds. It is not loud, it is not flashy, but it is glorious. It is a resurrection of confidence, of calling, of sacred identity. The boundaries you once feared to set now feel natural. The joy you once had to fake now flows freely. You do not look over your shoulder anymore, hoping they've changed, because you have changed. And once God rewrites your soul with truth, no counterfeit voice can rewrite it again. There is no need to seek revenge, no need to prove your side. You no longer require their apology to heal. Why? Because healing is no longer something they have the power to give. That power now belongs to God alone. And He has chosen to use it, not to restore what was toxic, but to redeem what was taken. You begin to see that what the enemy meant for harm, heaven has used for training. That the very fire meant to consume you has refined your discernment, your voice, your spiritual authority. You are not just someone who survived emotional abuse. You are someone who carries the fragrance of deliverance, the scent of someone who was pulled from the edge, reshaped in the wilderness, and sent back into the world with a testimony not of bitterness, but of power. That's why the narcissist can no longer touch you, not because they can't speak, but because their words no longer land. The spell is broken. The illusion has died. You have tasted truth, and no performance can replace it. You no longer bleed for peace. You no longer beg for clarity. You simply walk in it. And that walk is not solitary. For as you rise, you begin to recognize others, their eyes dimmed by the same confusion, their voices still trembling in the grip of counterfeit love. You do not rescue them. You do not preach at them. You simply walk as one who has been delivered, and your very presence becomes a quiet invitation. Freedom is possible. The cycle can end. You are not what they made you believe you were. This is how resurrection echoes. not in noise, but in testimony lived out. And while the narcissist scrambles for new sources to mimic, to manage, to manipulate, the one they once fed from now walks untouched. The soul they tried to dominate now bears the unmistakable mark of someone preserved by God, not because they were strong, but because heaven fought for them. That's the final truth. Their collapse was never your responsibility. Your resurrection was always God's promise. And in that promise you rise, no longer surviving their reign, but reigning under His.